sweep of the past that draws people to write and read such histories and indeed to play the game Civilization. It is a gateway to try to understand the long and very varied human past. And I think that is also perhaps why the historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who has a bit of an impish, playful wit, chose to write a magnificent book called Civilizations a few years ago now, back in 2000 in fact. And he acknowledges the biases, I guess, and the assumptions behind some of the eccentricities even about some of the major writers who have written about civilizations on a grand scale, and whose thinking and writing would have been influential, I guess, on the designers of the game Civilization. And people like Kenneth Clark, Norbert Elias, Ferdinand Brodel, who talked about the civilization of the Mediterranean, looking at civilization as an underlying social and cultural process that spanned identities bigger than regions. Kenneth Clark tended to identify civilization more with the Western tradition of art descended from, the classical models of Greece and Rome, but was also a not ungenerous admirer of other cultures. And then there's Arnold Toynbee, who wrote a 12-volume study of history between 1934 and 1961 that categorised 23 civilizations ranging from the ancient, like the Minoan or the Sumeric, through to more contemporary civilizations such as Western, that very, very vexed term Western civilization, which haunts us again today as we talk about the West versus Russia, Islamic, Hindu, and so on. And in the early 20th century, there was Oswald Spengler, whose famous book of prophecy about civilizational decline called The Fall of the West was not uninfluential on Nazi sort of thought, and even though that wasn't really necessarily where Spengler was coming from. So ever since World War II, it's been a more difficult term, but it is still a term that persists. Indeed, for example, it persists even in the sense of, my culture is good and yours is barbaric, in commonly even, I think, today, in people denouncing Russia as an uncivilized state, as indeed the magazine The Economist did not so long ago. It has also prospered in the whole concept of Western civilization that was particularly promoted, I guess, by American scholars during the Cold War, and has persisted to some degree since, even though it is a very complicated concept, let's say. Indeed, Fernandez Armesto says of the authors on Western civilization that they were under an obligation to say nothing new. Enough said about that. It is a concept that is widely, deeply discussed in history, to answer Isaac's question. And in many of those histories, Mesopotamia, has been seen as the cradle of civilization. It has had a very strong focus on how this triumphant civilization of the West emerged from those ancient roots and retained aspects of the culture of Greece and all the rest of it in the way that people would like. But behind that concept, there are a lot of difficulties. But it's a widely used concept, and so that's where you would have picked up the term of Cradles of Civilization or Western civilization, or just concepts of civilization as well. It's been a widely debated and at times reviled term, But I think Fernandez Amesto's book of 2000, Civilizations, provides a wonderful, witty and generous account of civilizations that gives us a bit of a new way of thinking about them that is well adapted to the multipolar world we're living in these days, and is without some of the weaknesses of concept that have given civilization a bit of a bad reputation. And I think there are four big points that Fernandez de Mesto makes in the opening essay of his book Civilizations that are worth focusing on before we talk a little bit more about the cradles of civilization. So they are that civilization is a process. Civilization is not progress. Civilization accomplishes something but need not be valued over other civilizations. And civilization is very much a process of adapting the environment. So let's just briefly talk about each of those key points so we've got a really good handle on the concept of civilizations. So first of all, civilizations is a process. Now, behind the concept of Western civilization or whatever dominant civilization you might want to talk about, there is a bit of a concept there that it is an achieved state. It's something that is an identity, and that it's a society. Perhaps it's the nature of a society. It's a cohesive, meaningful whole. And Fernandez Amesto really says that people have really struggled to find a coherent way to define the meaning of and the boundaries of such a defined state of a civilization. You know, what marks off Western civilization from Russian civilization or Middle Eastern civilization or Greek civilization or whatever term you want to use. What distinguishes European civilization from Christian civilization. And because some of those boundaries are so murky, the term has had a lot of difficulty with implementation. Perhaps most famously in recent times, in a book by Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, where he talks about effectively Chinese, Orthodox or Russian and Western civilizations clashing, Islamic civilizations clashing, but his boundaries of those civilizations are quite odd indeed and don't really recognise the diversities of society and end up being a little bit of a fudge of, current military alliances within the world. And I'm going to come back to Samuel Huntington in an episode after this because there's also some reflections in Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations on the special role of Ukraine in the Clash of Civilizations. Is Ukraine part of Russian civilization or European civilization? It was a boundary state that tested his theory, and it's interesting to look back on his reflections in the midst of the Russian-Ukrainian war. But if you look at civilization as a process, then it's less about describing civilizing in terms of internal standards of a society, but more a social process that is underway and has certain effects. It also tends to mean you don't look at civilizations as indivisible identities, big blocks that you can sort of manipulate around the world and define clearly when we have much more fragmented and complex societies. Importantly too, Fernandez Mesto says civilization is not progress. Now, this is particularly pernicious, Fernandez Mesto says, when, say, in some sociobiological accounts of societies, there's an argument put that, I guess, with the evolution of society, their brain evolves too, and therefore certain people are made superior over other people by culture or by culture-biology interactions, and have a implied right of domination. But even in more generous thinkers like Toynbee, civilization is associated with a sense of progress, and that the civilization is the ultimate accomplishment of human endeavour and human ability. It's usually treated as a bit of a growth away from more primitive societies, and tends to follow a familiar sequence, which I guess is embedded in the game. Civilization, from hunting to herding to agriculture to civilization, onward and upward to more complex social and cultural achievement. And Fernandez Mesto says the language of evolution bears a heavy responsibility for misleading people into thinking that civilization is a superior way of organising life simply because it happens late in history. Societies do not evolve, they just change. And that's a really important point for the concept of cradles of civilization, because again, the civilization is not coming from a cradle; it's moving from one situation to another. Nevertheless, there is certainly a sense in which civilizations accomplish something. If societies do not evolve, they just change. There's still significant achievement, I guess, in that, and that can be liked, and some of that achievement is also incredibly destructive. But Fernandez Mesto says there's really no checklist for being included in the distinct kind of society known as civilization, and this is where many people have fallen into a bit of a trap. The checklist approach might say that civilizations are distinguished by having cities or writing or recognisably great art or agriculture or state systems, big government systems, or they might have a certain level of economic achievement, material or population success or technological achievement. Again, perhaps an idea that's still around sometimes when people might say that Russia is an uncivilized place, or the country is an uncivilized, the rural part of the world is less civilized than us urban slickers. But there are no admission criteria to the ranks of the civilized. It is an open club available to many communities that have sought to adapt their environment. And so Fernandez Mesto produces a vastly more diverse and interesting list of civilizations and bends the concept of civilization to his own ends, to the concept of civilizations. And what is Fernandez Mesto's concept of civilizations? Well, he says the common element in many, many different civilizations is their programs for the systematic refashioning of their societies and their environments. For him, the story of civilization is not a story of growth or climbing up a technological ladder. It is a story of encounters with nature and with other cultures encountering other ecological niches along the way. He proposes to treat civilization as a relationship between humans and nature, and he gives 4 reasons for doing so. First of all, it's a change of perspective and offers fresh comparisons and understanding. Secondly, he says environments are real and objective and much more firm and definable than nebulous categories such as stages of development or levels of complexity of the society. Thirdly, he says to treat civilization as a way of adapting the environment, or a process of adapting the environment common to many, many, many cultures, even if expressed differently in many, many cultures, is consistent with the early use of the term in 18th, 17th and 18th century Europe, in which people were trying to think, how does the urban European, or the apparently sophisticated European, and the noble savage of America, those words of course in quotation marks, how can they think about their encounters with very different natural worlds? Indeed, he even says that Toynbee, the great student of civilizations who wrote that 12-volume A Study in History, actually also defined civilization as a process in his early work in which human individuals are moulded less by the environment and more by their own actions. Finally, Fernandez Mesto says that treating civilization as a process of adapting the environment reveals some important truths. And if I quote here, he says, "The very act of classifying civilizations environmentally reveals truths, that no linear or progressive story unites their histories. So there is no one cradle of civilization, that they are neither determined nor uninfluenced by environment, that no habitable environment is utterly uncivilizable." Again, a bit of a contrast to the concept of cradle of civilization. That environmental diversity helps, that civilizations start in specific environments but can sometimes conquer, colonize, or cross others, and that peoples of diverse provenance have excelled as civilizers in different conditions. No part of the world is uniquely privileged, no people uniquely fitted for civilization. There is in sum no single cradle of civilization, no single technology tree story, and no part of the world untouched by civilization, if you like, no part of the world in which there is not an origin story of civilization, no part of the world in which there is not some cradle of civilization.